My beloved child, something about last night looked ordinary from the outside, yet one small moment changed the emotional direction of everything that followed. Your soulmate was with someone, yes, and a third party was closer to the situation than you might expect, but what happened was not as simple as appearances could make it seem. There was a conversation, a pause, and then a question that neither of them seemed prepared to answer. Don't skip, because the most meaningful part of this story is not who was sitting beside your soulmate. It is what your soulmate suddenly realized while they were there. Imagine the scene quietly. Nothing dramatic. No grand announcement. Just an ordinary night, familiar voices, a phone resting nearby, and your soulmate trying to remain present while their thoughts kept wandering somewhere else. At first, even they did not understand why. Someone across from them was speaking, yet certain words barely registered. Their attention kept drifting toward something they had tried not to think about for a while. You. Not in some exaggerated, impossible way, but in the deeply human way a person remembers someone when the room around them suddenly feels strangely disconnected from what their heart actually wants. And this is where the third party began noticing something. They saw the pauses. They noticed how your soulmate would seem engaged for a moment and then become quiet again. They noticed the way a simple question could change your soulmate's expression. But they still did not understand what was happening underneath the surface. Then came a question that seemed harmless: are you actually happy? Your soulmate could have answered immediately. It would have been easy to smile and say yes. It would have been easy to change the subject. Instead, there was silence. Just a few seconds, perhaps, but sometimes a few seconds reveal more than an hour of carefully chosen words. Something important is waiting for you inside that silence, because your soulmate wasn't comparing two people. They were comparing two versions of themselves. The version that could keep everything comfortable, predictable, and uncomplicated, and the version that felt most natural whenever thoughts of you appeared. That realization unsettled them, not because something terrible had happened, but because they suddenly understood that emotional truth cannot always be organized into neat explanations. Sometimes a person can spend weeks convincing themselves that they have moved forward, only to discover during one ordinary evening that a single memory still reaches somewhere deeper than expected. The strange part came next. The person beside your soulmate mentioned something completely unrelated to you: a place, a song, perhaps even a small detail from another conversation, and somehow it reminded your soulmate of something you once said. They almost smiled. It happened instinctively. Then they caught themselves. The third party noticed. "What are you thinking about?" they asked. Your soulmate hesitated. Stay till the end, because the answer they almost gave was very different from the one they eventually chose. They said, "Nothing." But it wasn't nothing. It was a memory that had returned with unusual clarity. Maybe it was the way you listened when they were struggling to explain themselves. Maybe it was a moment when you understood what they meant before they finished speaking. Maybe it was something incredibly small that nobody else would consider important. Yet last night, that small memory carried weight. Your soulmate began realizing that what stayed with them about you was never only attraction, excitement, or curiosity. It was the feeling of being recognized. There are people who enter our lives loudly, and there are people whose presence becomes meaningful through tiny moments we do not appreciate until later. Your soulmate was beginning to understand which kind of person you had been for them. Then the atmosphere shifted again. The third party, sensing that something was unresolved, started asking more questions. Not aggressively. Not with anger. More like someone trying to understand a puzzle they had only recently realized existed. Is there someone you never really got over? That question landed differently. Your soulmate looked away. And for the first time that evening, the person sitting with them seemed to understand that the distance they were sensing had a history. Your soulmate did not immediately say your name. That matters. Because this was not a performance. Nobody was trying to create a dramatic confession. It was almost the opposite. Your soulmate seemed reluctant to admit what was becoming increasingly obvious even to themselves. And then something unexpectedly gentle happened. Instead of pushing for an answer, the person beside them said, "You don't have to pretend with me." Those words opened a door your soulmate had been keeping closed. They exhaled. Their shoulders softened. And finally, quietly, they admitted that there was someone they still thought about. Someone connected to unfinished emotions. Someone whose absence had raised questions they had never properly answered. The third party listened carefully. They had expected perhaps a passing memory, an old attachment, something your soulmate could easily dismiss. But as your soulmate continued, their tone changed. They began describing not merely what happened between you, but what your presence had meant. That difference surprised even them. They spoke about moments they had misunderstood. They admitted that certain things you did made more sense now than they did at the time. They remembered your patience. They remembered moments when you seemed distant, and suddenly wondered whether perhaps you had simply been protecting your own heart. And somewhere in that conversation, your soulmate reached a realization they had been avoiding. They had spent so much time wondering how you felt about them that they had not been fully honest about how strongly they felt about you. There was another pause. This one lasted longer. The third party asked, "Then why aren't you talking to them?" Your soulmate had no easy answer. And maybe that is the part that will feel familiar to you. Sometimes two people can care deeply and still become trapped inside hesitation. One waits for certainty. The other waits for reassurance. Both assume silence means something it never actually meant. Your soulmate began replaying old moments through this new understanding. Words you said. Things you didn't say. Times when you stayed a little longer than necessary. Times when you pulled away because the situation felt unclear. One memory after another seemed to return, almost as though last night had unexpectedly become a mirror. But the third party was watching all of this happen too, and what they realized next quietly changed their own understanding of your place in your soulmate's life. They noticed that whenever your soulmate spoke about you, the conversation became more specific. Details appeared. Your soulmate remembered tiny things, your reactions, your humor, the way you expressed certain thoughts. That kind of memory does not necessarily promise an outcome, but it does reveal significance. And the third party understood that immediately. They asked one final question: if they were standing here right now, what would you actually want to say? Your soulmate lowered their eyes. For several seconds, nothing came. Then, almost as if speaking more to themselves than anyone else, they said, "I think I misunderstood more than I realized." Stay with that sentence for a moment. They did not blame you. They did not blame circumstances. They did not even blame themselves. They simply recognized that perhaps both of you had been interpreting the connection through incomplete information. And strangely, that realization brought relief. Because misunderstanding can sometimes be repaired in ways that indifference cannot. Your soulmate began thinking about what they would say if another conversation ever happened between you. They imagined explaining why they had gone quiet at certain moments. Why they had acted uncertain when they actually cared. Why they sometimes appeared distant precisely when their emotions were becoming stronger. They wondered whether you had interpreted their hesitation as rejection. And suddenly, your soulmate looked genuinely troubled by that possibility, not overwhelmed, not broken, simply thoughtful in the way a person becomes thoughtful when they realize their silence may have communicated something they never intended. Then came the moment no one expected. The third party did not try to compete with the memory of you. They did not dismiss it. Instead, they said something surprisingly mature: maybe you need clarity more than distraction. Your soulmate looked at them differently after that. Because that single sentence exposed what the entire night had quietly been showing them. They had been trying to move around unanswered feelings instead of walking directly toward them. And somewhere inside that realization, your name became less like a memory and more like a question waiting to be answered. Don't skip, because what happened afterward was even more revealing. Later, when your soulmate was finally alone, they picked up their phone. They did not immediately message you. They simply stared at the screen for a while, thinking. Perhaps they opened an old conversation. Perhaps they looked at something connected to you that they had not revisited in some time. Whatever the exact detail, the emotional meaning was simple: after everything that happened that night, their thoughts returned to you without anyone guiding them there. And this time, instead of pushing the feeling away, they allowed themselves to sit with it. They asked the question they had avoided for far too long: what am I actually afraid of? The answer surprised them. It was not you. It was vulnerability. It was the possibility of reaching towards something meaningful without knowing exactly what would happen next. It was the fear of saying too much after having said too little for so long. Yet underneath all of those uncertainties was something calmer: a recognition that clarity might be worth the discomfort of honesty. And that is where last night truly changed direction. What began as an evening involving someone else became a quiet confrontation with feelings your soulmate had never fully resolved. The third party may have entered the night thinking they understood the situation, but by the end, even they could see that your connection carried a history that could not be reduced to one conversation or one assumption. Still, there is one detail you have not heard yet. One thing your soulmate almost said aloud but stopped themselves from revealing. It came after they looked at their phone, after they remembered your words, and after they finally admitted what they had misunderstood. And when you hear what that unfinished sentence was, you may understand why the hours after last night felt so different to them, because the sentence did not begin with goodbye. It began with the possibility of finally telling you the truth. There was one sentence your soulmate almost sent last night, and the reason they erased it may tell you more than the message itself ever could. Their fingers hovered over the screen for longer than they expected, because once the words appeared in front of them, the situation suddenly felt real. They had typed something simple, something that carried no dramatic promise and no demand for an answer. It began with, "I think there are things I should have told you sooner." And then they stopped. Not because the feeling disappeared, but because seeing it written down forced them to confront how much had remained unfinished between you. Don't skip, because what happened next was not about hesitation alone. It was about the realization that your soulmate had spent so much time protecting themselves from an uncertain outcome that they had also protected themselves from the possibility of understanding you more deeply. They deleted the sentence, locked the phone, placed it beside them, and tried to move on with the night. But the thought returned. Then another memory surfaced. Then another. And something unusual began happening inside their perspective. Moments they had once interpreted as confusing started becoming clearer when viewed from your side. They remembered times when you seemed quieter than usual. They remembered moments when your energy changed after something they said casually. At the time, your soulmate may have assumed you were losing interest, becoming distant, or simply moving in another direction. Last night, however, they considered another possibility. What if you were waiting for them to show you that the connection mattered? What if you were not pulling away because you felt nothing, but because you had reached a point where uncertainty was asking too much from you? That question stayed with them. And sometimes one sincere question can rearrange an entire story. Your soulmate began remembering conversations they had replayed many times before, but this time they listened differently. Instead of focusing only on your words, they thought about the pauses around them. The things you almost said. The questions you asked indirectly. The moments when you gave them an opportunity to be more open and they answered carefully because they were afraid of revealing too much. It was as if they had suddenly discovered another layer beneath a familiar memory. Something important is waiting for you here, because your soulmate was not simply thinking, "I miss this person." The deeper thought was, "Maybe I never fully understood what they were trying to show me." That realization carried a different kind of weight. Missing someone can remain inside nostalgia. Understanding that you may have misread someone can create movement. And that was exactly what began happening after the night grew quieter. Your soulmate stood up, walked around for a while, and found themselves returning to the question the third party had asked earlier: if they were standing here right now, what would you actually say? At first, your soulmate had answered vaguely. Now, alone, the answer became more honest. They would tell you that certain moments mattered more than they admitted. They would tell you that some of their silence came from uncertainty rather than indifference. They would tell you there were times they wanted to reach closer but worried that doing so would change everything between you. And perhaps most importantly, they would admit that they often waited for a perfect sign when what the connection really needed was a simple conversation. That thought almost made them laugh softly at themselves. How strange, they realized, that two people can spend so much energy looking for certainty while quietly creating more uncertainty through silence. Then something shifted again. Your soulmate remembered the person they had been with earlier that night. They remembered the third party watching their expression change whenever the conversation moved toward you. And for the first time, they wondered how visible their feelings had actually been. They had assumed they were hiding everything well. Yet perhaps they had never hidden it as completely as they believed. Perhaps the people around them had noticed the way certain topics changed their energy. Perhaps the third party had recognized something your soulmate was still trying to explain away. This did not make your soulmate uncomfortable in the way you might imagine. Instead, it made them curious about themselves. Why did your name still carry emotional weight? Why could an ordinary question bring back so much detail? Why did the thought of speaking honestly to you feel frightening and relieving at the same time? Stay till the end, because the answer your soulmate began finding was quieter than expected. They were not searching for some perfect romantic story. They were searching for emotional honesty. They wanted to know whether the connection between you had been misunderstood, mistimed, or simply left unfinished because neither side felt safe enough to reveal everything. That distinction mattered. Your soulmate began seeing that there was a difference between wanting to return to the past and wanting clarity about what the past meant. And last night, clarity suddenly became more important than pride. Their phone was still nearby. They picked it up again. This time they did not begin typing immediately. They opened the conversation connected to you and scrolled slowly. Some messages made them smile. Others brought a quiet seriousness to their face. One particular exchange stopped them. Maybe you had said something ordinary at the time, something like, "I just want you to be honest with me," or perhaps, "You don't always have to pretend everything is fine." Whatever the exact words were, your soulmate now heard them differently. Back then, they may have believed you were asking for reassurance. Last night, they realized you might have been offering permission. Permission for them to be imperfect. Permission to admit uncertainty. Permission to tell you what they were actually feeling without already knowing how everything would end. That realization softened something in them. They had been so focused on saying the right thing that they had often said too little. And suddenly your patience made more sense. Then another thought appeared, one that surprised your soulmate enough to make them put the phone down again. They wondered whether you had already made peace with the silence. Whether you had learned to carry the connection differently. Whether reaching out now would disturb something you had worked hard to settle inside yourself. This is where their hesitation became more respectful. They did not want to arrive in your life simply because they were experiencing a late realization. They understood that your feelings mattered too. And in that awareness, something inside them matured. Instead of thinking, "I need to tell them everything right now," they began thinking, "If I ever speak, I need to speak clearly, gently, and without expecting anything in return." That is a very different kind of intention. It does not chase. It does not demand. It simply values truth enough to offer it carefully. The third party could not see this part of the night. They had already gone their separate way. Yet their earlier question had opened something your soulmate could no longer close easily. Your soulmate began considering what honesty would actually look like. Not a dramatic confession. Not an overwhelming message. Perhaps just a small opening. A simple acknowledgement. Something like, "I've been thinking about our last conversation," or, "There's something I understand differently now." And then they stopped again, because another realization had arrived. The conversation they wanted with you was not only about what happened between you. It was about who they had become since then. They had learned things about communication. About fear. About timing. About how easy it is to mistake self-protection for strength. And maybe that was why last night mattered so much. Being with someone else had unexpectedly shown them something about themselves that solitude had not. They recognize the difference between being occupied and being emotionally present. They recognize that company does not automatically create connection. And when they ask themselves where they had felt most genuinely understood, their thoughts return to certain moments with you. Not every moment. Not an idealized version of the past. Just specific, real instances where they had felt seen without needing to perform. That mattered more than they expected. Then came a moment so quiet that nobody else would have considered it significant. Your soulmate opened the draft area one more time. This time they typed only 4 words, "I finally understand something." They stared at the sentence. 4 ordinary words. Yet behind them were weeks, perhaps months, of things they had avoided naming. They almost continued. They almost explained what they understood. But instead, they saved the thought privately. Why? Because they realized they wanted to be certain that whatever came next was not simply a reaction to one emotional night. They wanted to know whether the clarity would still feel true in the morning. That choice says something meaningful. They were not being impulsive. They were trying to separate temporary emotion from a deeper realization. And when morning came, something unexpected happened. The feeling did not disappear. The intensity softened, yes, but the understanding remained. Your soulmate woke with the same sentence somewhere in the back of their mind, "I finally understand something." They went through the beginning of their day normally. Small routines. Ordinary responsibilities. Yet underneath everything was a calm awareness that a conversation with you might eventually need to happen. Not because someone else told them to do it. Not because the third party pushed them. Because their own perspective had changed. And then the third party sent them a short message. Nothing dramatic. Just a few words referring back to the night before. Your soulmate read it once, then twice. The message said something that made them sit quietly for a moment. "I think you already know what you need to be honest about." That line stayed with them. The third party had no answer to give. They were simply reflecting back what they had observed. And sometimes that is enough. Your soulmate did not respond immediately. They looked at your conversation again. But this time their expression was different. There was less confusion. Less resistance. More acceptance. They were beginning to understand that clarity does not guarantee a particular outcome, but it can still be valuable. 2 people can speak honestly without knowing exactly what happens afterward. And perhaps that was what your soulmate had been afraid to accept. They had wanted certainty before vulnerability, when vulnerability often has to come first. Don't skip, because this is where one more hidden part of last night surfaced. During the earlier conversation, when the third party asked whether there was someone your soulmate had never completely understood, your soulmate did eventually say something about you that they had not admitted anywhere else. They said, "There was a moment when I think they were waiting for me to say something, and I didn't." The third party asked, "What do you think they wanted you to say?" Your soulmate went quiet. They had no answer then. But later, alone, the answer came back to them with surprising clarity. They believed you had not been waiting for some grand declaration. You had been waiting for reassurance that what you felt was not entirely one-sided. Just enough honesty to know you were not imagining the emotional depth between you. And your soulmate realized they may have never given you that reassurance clearly enough. That realization did not fill them with guilt. It filled them with understanding. They saw the past differently. They understood why you may have stepped back. They understood why certain conversations became complicated. And they began wondering whether you had walked away carrying questions they could have answered with a few sincere words. The thought stayed with them through the day. Yet there is still something they do not know about you now. They do not know how you would receive their honesty. They do not know whether your heart still holds the connection in the same way. And surprisingly, they are beginning to accept that they may not need to know in advance. What matters first is whether they are finally capable of telling the truth without trying to control the response. That is the change last night quietly created. But one piece remains. The third party noticed something during that conversation that your soulmate never realized they had revealed. It happened when your soulmate was asked one final question about you, and their answer came so naturally that even they seemed surprised after hearing themselves say it. Those few words changed the entire mood of the room, and they may explain why the third party stopped asking questions altogether. The answer came out before your soulmate had time to soften it, and the third party noticed immediately. They had asked one final question, almost casually: when you imagine your life feeling peaceful again, who is there? Your soulmate did not look down. They did not search for the safest response. They simply said, the person who made me feel like I didn't have to explain every part of myself. Then silence filled the room. Not uncomfortable silence. Recognizing silence. The kind that arrives when everyone present suddenly understands that the conversation has reached somewhere deeper than expected. Your soulmate seemed almost surprised by their own words because they had not mentioned your name, yet they knew exactly who they meant. And so did the third party. Don't skip, because this was the moment the entire situation stopped being about another person and started becoming about something your soulmate had been avoiding within themselves. The third party asked nothing else. They leaned back, allowed the moment to settle, and watched your soulmate sit with the truth of what they had just said. For the first time that evening, your soulmate was not trying to correct themselves. They were not explaining why the thought was complicated. They were simply letting it exist. And somewhere inside that quietness, one realization became impossible to ignore: the thing they remembered most about you was not excitement. It was ease. It was the strange comfort of feeling understood before every sentence had been perfectly arranged. Your soulmate began remembering small moments they had almost forgotten. A conversation that lasted longer than expected because neither of you wanted to end it. A time when you noticed a change in their mood without needing an explanation. A simple look, perhaps, or a sentence you said at exactly the right time. None of those moments had seemed enormous while they were happening. Yet now they were the memories rising first. That surprised them. They had assumed the dramatic moments would be the ones that remained. Instead, what survived most clearly were the quiet ones. And perhaps that is why last night affected them differently. Sitting with someone else made them notice the difference between being entertained and being emotionally understood. There was no judgment in that comparison. The other person had done nothing wrong. Your soulmate simply realized that connection cannot always be recreated by placing two people in the same room. Sometimes a particular kind of comfort develops slowly, through dozens of tiny exchanges, until one day its absence becomes more noticeable than its presence ever was. Something important is waiting for you here, because your soulmate did not suddenly decide that every difficulty between you had disappeared. They remembered those too. They remembered misunderstandings, poor timing, moments when both of you may have protected yourselves instead of speaking clearly. They understood that meaningful connections can still become complicated. But the surprising part was that those complications no longer erased the good. In the past, whenever your soulmate felt uncertain, they may have focused almost entirely on what was difficult. Last night, their perspective became more balanced. They could finally hold two truths at once: what happened between you had not always been easy, and it had still mattered deeply. That emotional maturity changed the way they remembered you. They no longer needed to turn the past into something perfect or something disappointing. It could simply be real. And real things are often more powerful than perfect stories because they contain room for growth. After the third party became quiet, your soulmate eventually asked a question of their own. Do you think someone can realize something too late? The third party thought for a moment before answering. Sometimes. But sometimes realizing it late is still better than never understanding it. Your soulmate carried that sentence home with them. It followed them into the quiet hours. It remained when the lights were off and the distractions had disappeared. And this is where something subtle began changing. Until then, your soulmate had been thinking mainly about whether they should speak to you. Now they began wondering what they would want you to feel if they did. That question transformed everything. They did not want you to feel pressured. They did not want you to feel responsible for fixing the past. They did not want a conversation that reopened old uncertainty without offering anything clearer. If they reached out, they wanted the message to feel different from before. More grounded. More accountable. More honest. That is why they kept rewriting the opening in their mind. I miss you felt too incomplete. Can we talk felt too abrupt. I've been thinking about you was true, but still not enough. The deeper message was something closer to this: I understand something now that I didn't understand then. And your soulmate knew that if they ever said those words, they would need to explain them. They would need to tell you what had changed. They would need to acknowledge that there were moments when you deserved clarity and received hesitation instead. They would need to admit that their silence sometimes came from fear of getting things wrong, even though silence itself created the very confusion they were trying to avoid. Stay till the end, because another detail from last night kept returning to them, and it was not something the third party said. It was something your soulmate did without realizing it. At one point in the conversation, while speaking about you, they reached for their phone automatically. They did not open anything. Their hands simply moved toward it. The third party noticed and smiled very slightly, not mockingly, but knowingly. Your soulmate noticed the smile and asked, "What?" The third party answered, "Nothing. I just think you already know who you want to talk to." Your soulmate laughed softly and looked away. But the comment landed. Because perhaps they did know. The uncertainty was not about who. It was about how. How do you speak after so much unsaid history? How do you acknowledge something meaningful without pretending nothing difficult ever happened? How do you tell another person, "I see it differently now," while respecting the possibility that they may have already moved forward? These questions followed your soulmate into the next morning, but something was changing beneath them. Fear was no longer the loudest emotion. Curiosity was beginning to replace it. What if you would understand? What if you had been waiting not for perfection, but simply for sincerity? What if the conversation they had imagined as impossible could actually begin with something very small? They did not let themselves build an entire future from those thoughts. That would have been easy, but they resisted. Instead, they focused on one possible step: honesty. Nothing more. Nothing less. And this mattered because your soulmate was beginning to understand that meaningful conversations are not contracts about the future. They are opportunities to bring clarity to the present. The third party's role in all of this surprised them too. Earlier, your soulmate may have assumed that talking about you in front of someone else would create tension. Instead, the opposite happened. The conversation became unexpectedly calm. The third party did not try to convince your soulmate to forget you. They did not turn you into a rival. They simply observed what was already there. And when they saw how naturally your soulmate spoke about you, they seemed to understand that pushing against those feelings would accomplish nothing. So they asked another gentle question: "What do you think you learned from knowing them?" Your soulmate's answer came slower this time. They said that you had taught them how important emotional consistency was. They said you had shown them that feeling understood could be more meaningful than being constantly impressed. They said they had learned that people sometimes pull away not because they care less, but because they no longer know where they stand. And then your soulmate stopped. That last sentence surprised them most of all. Because when they heard themselves say it, they realized they might finally understand something about you. Perhaps your distance had never been the rejection they feared. Perhaps it was the result of too much ambiguity. Perhaps you had reached a point where protecting your peace became necessary. Your soulmate could respect that now in a way they could not before. And strangely, that respect made their feelings calmer rather than more desperate. They no longer wanted to chase the past. They wanted to meet the truth of it. That distinction gave them room to breathe. Later that morning, your soulmate walked through their usual routine, but ordinary things kept carrying unexpected meaning. A place reminded them of a conversation. A phrase reminded them of your voice. A small joke brought back the way you once laughed. Yet instead of becoming lost in nostalgia, they began asking a different question each time: what did I miss when this was happening? That question became almost like a lens through which they reviewed the connection. They remembered one occasion when you had tried to speak honestly, but they responded lightly because seriousness made them nervous. They remembered another time when you gave them space after sensing they were overwhelmed. At the time they interpreted that space as distance. Now they wondered whether it had been kindness. They remembered a moment when you seemed disappointed but said, "It's okay." And for the first time, they considered that maybe it had not been completely okay. Maybe you had wanted reassurance they did not know how to give. These realizations were not comfortable, but they were valuable. Your soulmate was learning to look at the connection from outside their own perspective. That is a quiet form of growth. It does not change what already happened, but it can change what happens next. Don't skip, because by afternoon, your soulmate did something different. They did not message you yet. Instead, they wrote down what they wanted to say. Not a polished letter. Just fragments. I should have communicated better. I understood your silence too late. You mattered more than I showed. I don't want to assume how you feel now. I just want to be honest about what I understand. When they looked at those lines together, something inside them settled. This was not about trying to convince you of anything. It was about finally saying the things that had remained trapped behind pride, confusion, and timing. And then they noticed one sentence they had written without thinking: I never stopped wondering whether I misunderstood us. That sentence stayed on the page longer than all the others. Your soulmate read it several times. They knew it was close to the center of everything. Not, I never moved on. Not, we were meant to be. Nothing absolute. Simply, I never stopped wondering whether I misunderstood us. That felt true. It acknowledged the past without making demands on the future. And perhaps that is why it frightened them slightly. True sentences often do. They reveal where we actually stand. The third party checked in again later. A simple message: you seem quieter today. Your soulmate replied, I'm thinking. The response came back, about them? Your soulmate stared at the screen. This time they did not deny it. They answered, about what I should have understood sooner. Even typing that felt like another small step toward honesty. There was no dramatic reaction from the third party. Only one sentence: then maybe start by being honest with yourself. Your soulmate smiled when they read it because that was exactly what had been happening since last night. They were finally admitting something they had kept turning into a question. You mattered. The connection mattered. And their fear of vulnerability had influenced more of their decisions than they wanted to admit. But there was another realization underneath that one, and this was the part they had not expected at all. Your soulmate understood that if they ever speak to you again, they cannot approach you as the person they were then. They cannot arrive carrying the same assumptions. They cannot expect you to decode half-finished feelings. They would have to be more present. More clear. More willing to hear your perspective without immediately defending their own. In other words, the conversation they imagined with you was beginning to feel less like a confession and more like a genuine meeting between two people who had both lived through the silence differently. That idea gave them hope without creating fantasy. Maybe there would be warmth. Maybe there would be closure. Maybe there would be a new beginning. They did not know. And for once, not knowing did not stop them from recognizing what was true. As night began approaching again, your soulmate returned to the message they had almost sent. They opened the empty space and typed slowly. There's something I understand differently now, and I've been wondering whether I should tell you. They read it once. Then again. Their thumb hovered above the screen. This time, however, they did not delete it immediately. Something about the sentence felt respectful. It did not pressure you. It did not assume your feelings. It simply opened a door. Your soulmate sat with it, feeling that familiar mix of nervousness and relief. Then one more thought entered their mind, and it changed the tone of everything. They remembered the third party's question from the night before: when you imagine your life feeling peaceful again, who is there? Your soulmate finally understood why their answer had come so quickly. They had not been imagining a person who could rescue them from uncertainty. They had been remembering the version of themselves that felt most genuine around you. And perhaps that was the deepest realization of all. Sometimes we miss a person because we miss them. But sometimes we also miss who we were when we felt safe enough to be sincere. Your soulmate began wondering whether you had ever felt something similar. Whether certain memories still carried warmth for you. Whether you too had looked back and realized that some of the distance between you had come from things neither of you knew how to say. They did not pretend to know your answer. And that humility mattered. But just as they were about to decide what to do with the message, something happened that interrupted the entire moment. A notification appeared. Not from the third party. Not from you. It was connected to something from the past, something your soulmate had almost forgotten existed. They opened it without thinking, and what they saw brought back one specific memory involving you that changed the meaning of the sentence they were about to send. For several seconds they simply stared at the screen, because they suddenly remembered exactly what you had said on the day everything between you began to change, and this time, they finally understood why you said it. The memory came back with almost uncomfortable clarity, not because it was painful, but because your soulmate finally heard your old words without filtering them through their own fear. On that day, when everything between you had started becoming less certain, you had said something simple. You had told them, "I just don't know what you want from me anymore." At the time, your soulmate had heard frustration. They had assumed you were asking them for an answer they were not ready to give. They had become careful, perhaps even quieter, believing that giving you space would prevent the situation from becoming more complicated. But now, staring at that reminder from the past, they understood something they had missed completely. You may not have been asking them to define the entire future. You may simply have been asking whether your place in their heart was real enough to be acknowledged. That difference changed everything. Your soulmate sat very still, allowing the realization to settle. They remembered what happened after you said those words. Perhaps they gave you a vague response. Perhaps they changed the subject. Perhaps they told themselves that the safest thing was to say nothing until they understood their own feelings completely. But silence rarely stays neutral when emotions are involved. Silence gets interpreted. It becomes distance. It becomes doubt. It becomes a space where two people begin filling in the missing information with their own fears. Don't skip, because what your soulmate realized next was not simply that they should have spoken more. It was that you might have walked away believing something about yourself that was never true. You might have wondered whether you had imagined the connection. Whether you had cared more. Whether the moments that felt meaningful to you had somehow meant less to them. And as that possibility entered your soulmate's mind, their expression changed. They remembered the ways they had looked at you when they thought you weren't noticing. They remembered conversations they replayed afterward. They remembered the strange emptiness that appeared when communication became less frequent. None of that had been meaningless. They simply had not known how to translate their feelings into language at the right time. Now, however, they were beginning to understand the cost of leaving important things untranslated. Something important is waiting for you here, because this was the first moment your soulmate stopped asking, "Should I tell them how I feel?" and started asking, do they deserve to know what was actually true? That question felt different. It removed some of the pressure. Honesty no longer felt like an attempt to create a particular outcome. It felt like an act of respect. If you had spent any part of the past wondering whether you mattered, your soulmate suddenly wanted you to know that you did. Whether anything happened after that would be another question entirely. But the truth itself seemed worthy of being spoken. They returned to the unfinished message. There's something I understand differently now, and I've been wondering whether I should tell you. This time they added another sentence. I think there were moments when you were asking me for clarity, and I mistook that for pressure. They stopped. Read it slowly. Then placed the phone down again. Not because the sentence felt wrong. Because it felt unusually accurate. Your soulmate had always thought they needed the perfect explanation before approaching you. Now they were realizing that perhaps the most meaningful explanation would simply be an honest one. I misunderstood you. I was afraid. I cared more than I knew how to show. Ordinary sentences. Human sentences. The kind that rarely sound dramatic, yet can change the emotional meaning of an entire history. And then something unexpected happened inside them. Instead of immediately thinking about how you might respond, your soulmate began remembering who you were during those uncertain moments. They remembered that you had tried, in your own way, to communicate. Maybe you had asked questions carefully because you did not want to overwhelm them. Maybe you had given them multiple chances to speak openly. Maybe you had withdrawn only after realizing that remaining in uncertainty was becoming emotionally exhausting. Your soulmate could finally see the dignity in that choice. You had not necessarily disappeared to punish them. You may simply have decided not to beg for clarity that should have been offered willingly. That realization created respect. Deep respect. And with that respect came a softer understanding of your silence. Stay till the end, because the third party was about to become part of the story again in a way your soulmate had not expected. A message arrived from them later that afternoon. Your soulmate almost ignored it, assuming it would be another simple check-in. Instead, the third party wrote, I've been thinking about what you said last night. I think you should stop asking whether your feelings are convenient and start asking whether they're honest. Your soulmate read the message twice. It was not an instruction. It was an observation. Yet it landed at exactly the right moment. Convenient feelings are easy. They fit neatly into circumstances. They require little courage. Honest feelings can be quieter and far less predictable. They do not automatically tell us what to do, but they tell us what is true. Your soulmate began seeing that much of their confusion had come from trying to make their emotions fit the circumstances instead of simply acknowledging them. They had thought, this is complicated, therefore perhaps it should not matter. They had thought, too much time has passed, therefore perhaps the feeling is no longer relevant. They had thought, I don't know what they feel now, therefore I should say nothing. But each conclusion had avoided the more basic truth: you had mattered enough to remain in their thoughts even after the circumstances changed. That did not guarantee a reunion. It did not promise anything dramatic. But it deserved recognition. And your soulmate was finally giving it that recognition. They responded to the third party with only one sentence: I think I've been confusing uncertainty with a reason to stay silent." The reply came quickly. "That sounds important." Your soulmate stared at those words and smiled faintly. Yes. It was important. Not because something huge had suddenly happened outside of them, but because something subtle had changed inside. They were no longer waiting to become fearless. They were beginning to understand that courage often arrives while uncertainty is still present. Then your soulmate did something they had avoided for a long time. They opened the old conversation between you and scrolled all the way back to one of the earliest exchanges. There you were, before the confusion, before the hesitation, before either of you had started measuring every word. The conversation was lighter then. Natural. You asked questions. They answered without overthinking. You teased each other gently. You shared small pieces of your day that would have seemed meaningless to anyone else. Your soulmate found themselves smiling at how easy it had once felt. And then a surprising thought appeared: perhaps the connection had not become complicated because it was wrong. Perhaps it became complicated because it started mattering. When people care little, they rarely overthink every detail. When something begins touching a vulnerable place, suddenly every pause feels significant. Every message gets reread. Every silence invites interpretation. Your soulmate recognized themselves in that pattern. The closer they felt to you, the more cautious they became. The more cautious they became, the less reassurance they gave you. The less reassurance you received, the more uncertain you became. And slowly, without either of you intentionally choosing it, the connection became a loop of mutual hesitation. That realization was almost startling in its simplicity. There may never have been one dramatic moment that changed everything. It may have been dozens of tiny moments when both of you waited for the other person to make the emotional risk first. Don't skip, because your soulmate then remembered one evening when you had done exactly that. You had taken a risk. You had said something warmer than usual, perhaps something that hinted at how deeply you cared. Your soulmate remembered reading it and feeling their heart respond immediately. But instead of matching your openness, they answered carefully. Not coldly. Just safely. They had worried that if they responded with the same emotional intensity, they would reveal too much. Last night's conversation suddenly gave that memory new meaning. Your soulmate understood how their safe answer might have felt from your side. You had offered something vulnerable and received something controlled. Maybe that was one of the moments when you began stepping back. Your soulmate closed their eyes briefly. They did not blame themselves harshly. They understood that at the time they had been doing the best they knew how to do. But understanding the past does not require pretending every choice was perfect. Growth often begins with being able to say, "I would handle that differently now." And your soulmate knew they would. If you offered vulnerability today, they would not hide behind vague words. If something confused them, they would ask instead of assuming. If they cared, they would try to let that care be visible. That realization made the idea of speaking to you feel less like returning to the past and more like showing you who they had become. Something softened in them after that. They no longer felt the need to write a long message explaining every detail. In fact, the longer they considered it, the more they realized that overwhelming you with months of reflection might not be the kindest approach. Perhaps the first step needed to be small. Honest, but small. A door, not a flood. They rewrote the message again. I've been thinking about something I misunderstood between us. If you're ever comfortable talking, I'd like to explain. Your soulmate read it aloud quietly. It sounded calmer. Respectful. It gave you choice. It did not demand that you revisit anything you did not want to revisit. Most importantly, it reflected the new understanding they had gained. Honesty should create space, not pressure. Their thumb hovered again. And then, almost as if the universe of ordinary coincidences had a sense of timing, another old memory appeared on their screen. A photo from months ago. Nothing dramatic. Perhaps a place the two of you had once discussed. Perhaps something from a day when the connection still felt uncomplicated. Your soulmate looked at the image and remembered exactly what had happened around it. You had been talking about the future, not necessarily your future together, just life. Things you wanted to experience. Places you wanted to see. The kind of person you hoped to become. And your soulmate remembered thinking, even then, how naturally they could imagine you still being somewhere in their life years later. They had never told you that. The memory surprised them because it revealed that their feelings had carried a quiet sense of continuity long before they consciously understood it. They had not necessarily been planning anything. They simply assumed, emotionally, that you would still exist in their world somehow. And when you gradually stopped being part of their everyday life, that absence had affected them more than they admitted. The third party's question from last night returned yet again. When you imagine your life feeling peaceful again, who is there? Your soulmate now understood why their answer had been immediate. Peace was not about possession. It was about familiarity. About emotional ease. About the people around whom you can be unfinished and still feel understood. That was what you represented in some of their strongest memories. Stay till the end, because another subtle shift was taking place. Your soulmate was beginning to think less about what they had lost and more about what they had learned. There is power in that shift. Regret keeps us facing backward. Understanding lets us carry the past forward without being trapped by it. They could not change the fact that they had been hesitant. They could not rewrite the moments when you needed clarity. But they could choose not to repeat those patterns. Whether with you or in any meaningful relationship, they now understood the importance of saying what is real while there is still an opportunity to say it. And strangely, that lesson made their feelings for you feel calmer. They were no longer clinging to an imagined outcome. They were simply acknowledging significance. There was dignity in that. Evening began settling outside. The same time of day when the previous night's unexpected conversation had started changing everything. Your soulmate noticed the light outside fading and felt the contrast between who they had been 24 hours earlier and who they were now. Yesterday they had been avoiding one question. Today they were preparing to answer it. They opened your conversation again. The message remained unsent. I've been thinking about something I misunderstood between us. If you're ever comfortable talking, I'd like to explain. They looked at it for a long time. Then they added one more line, no expectations. I just think you deserved more clarity than I gave you. That was the sentence. The moment it appeared, your soulmate knew they had reached the heart of everything. Not, come back. Not, choose me. Not, we have to fix this. Just acknowledgement. You deserved clarity. And for whatever reason, they had not been able to give it before. Their hand relaxed around the phone. The fear was still there, but it no longer controlled the entire moment. Your soulmate understood that your response, whatever it might be, belonged to you. Their responsibility was simply to approach you honestly and respectfully. And this was where the third party's role became almost unexpectedly meaningful. Someone who could have become part of a confusing triangle had instead become a mirror. Their questions had helped your soulmate see something that had been hidden beneath months of assumptions. The third party had not created the feeling. They had simply noticed it. And perhaps that was what surprised your soulmate most about the entire night. They had entered that conversation thinking the subject would be something completely different. They left understanding you more clearly than they had in a long time. But just when your soulmate seemed ready to decide whether to send the message, the third party called. Not texted. Called. Your soulmate hesitated, then answered. The voice on the other end sounded calm but unusually serious. There's one thing I didn't tell you last night, the third party said. Your soulmate became still. What? There was a pause. Then came the sentence that changed the emotional direction once more. When you were talking about them, you said something you probably don't remember saying. Your soulmate frowned. They genuinely had no idea what the third party meant. What did I say? Another pause. Longer this time. And then the third party repeated the exact words your soulmate had spoken late last night, words that had slipped out so naturally they had never even registered them. When your soulmate heard them now, their entire expression changed, because those words revealed something deeper than missing you, deeper than regret, and deeper than wondering what could have been. They revealed the one truth your soulmate had been circling around without ever saying directly, and after hearing it repeated back to them, they finally knew what the next message to you needed to contain.